Yes, this might be any city of the Deep South going about its daily business. But there is something different about it now, especially here in the heart of the city. What's different? The buses are empty. Why? Because the Negro people aren't riding them. Because one woman said, "I have had enough." And suddenly, just like that, 50,000 voices answered, "Amen, sister, enough for us too."
Hold on. I'm sure this is a story we've all heard about the Montgomery boycott. Rosa Parks gets on the bus, she's tired, a white man asks her to give up her seat, she refuses, she gets arrested, and then everybody comes together and boycotts the bus system in Montgomery. Pretty simple story, right? But what if I were to tell you the story that you learned and were taught in school is not that simple?
A bus protest which literally electrified the nation. And that was the day when we decided that we were not going to take segregated buses any longer. And you know, when we planned the bus boycott, we said if we could just get about 50 or 60% of the Negroes of Montgomery not to ride buses, this would be an effective boycott.
Please exit through the rear door.
Doors open.
Let's start off by saying this. The Montgomery boycott wasn't the first bus boycott to happen in the South. The first recorded, organized bus boycott happened in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, 2 years before the Montgomery bus boycott. So if this one is the first, why is it less talked about? In order to get an answer to this question, we have to understand what the Baton Rouge bus boycott was. The Baton Rouge bus boycott launched on June 19, 1953. The movement was spearheaded by Reverend T.J. Jemison, Dr. Alvin Williams, World War II veteran Willis Reed, and entrepreneur Raymond Scott. Together, they held 4 mass meetings and raised around $6,000 in just 2 days. These meetings would be held in local churches, such as the Mount Zion Baptist Church. These church meetings were essential in getting the entire black community together in order to plan the boycott. In these meetings, it was decided that they would set up a free taxi service for all the people participating in the boycott. The $6,000 raised would go to the drivers of these community carpool services, for gas, maintenance, and for new vehicles. In the end, 25 private vehicles were used for the bus boycott, and in 6 days the boycott was successful. But why was this successful? Well, in Baton Rouge, over 80% of the bus riders were black. This meant that the local bus companies lost around 4/5 of their ridership. This was obviously financially devastating for the bus company, and politically devastating for the city. In an agreement to end the bus boycott, the city passed Ordinance 252. However, this didn't quite end segregation on the buses in Baton Rouge. The ordinance only expanded the neutral zone in the buses, the area where both blacks and whites can occupy the bus. Within the ordinance, the front 2 seats were still white only. The reason I bring up the Baton Rouge bus boycott is because historians, such as Alden D. Morris, believe that this bus boycott heavily influenced the Montgomery bus boycott, which makes sense because the strategies for the Baton Rouge bus boycott was nearly copy and pasted for the Montgomery bus boycott. The church meeting, the fundraising, then the carpool. But why are they so similar? Because Reverend Martin Luther King met with Reverend T.J. Jemison. During this meeting, they discussed a free carpool system. Once this strategy was understood, the bus boycott could begin. The bus boycott went on for, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go back a bit. Montgomery has had a history of transit boycotts. From 1900 to 1902, Montgomery already had its first public transit boycott. This public transit boycott was against the initial implementation of Jim Crow laws segregating public streetcars in the South. This boycott lasted for 2 years, and despite being promising, wasn't that successful. The reason why? It was too early on, and the concept of even paid taxis was in its infancy phase. This meant that most people participating in the boycott walked. But the residents of Montgomery weren't the only ones fighting against the Jim Crow laws. In 1906, the Montgomery City Council passed an ordinance requiring blacks and whites to ride on separate streetcars. This ordinance was similar to the laws placed on railroads at the time, and was thus used as the reasoning behind the ordinance. However, the Montgomery Traction Company, the owners of the streetcars, refused to comply with the ordinance. Their reasoning, because the service would be incredibly unprofitable. This ordinance would have required the Montgomery Streetcar Company to run twice as many streetcars on their existing routes. On November 23rd, all streetcars were stopped. And when I say stopped, I mean stopped. For 2 hours, the streetcars were literally stopped in the street. Newspaper correspondent H.W. Laird wrote,
Street Railway System of Montgomery, Alabama tied up November 23, 1906, because the Montgomery Traction Company refused to obey an ordinance calling for separate cars for the handling of the two races. Traffic was held up almost half a day and was only resumed when a judge of the state courts granted an injunction restraining the enforcement of the law on the showing of the company that it was impossible to provide the separate cars. Citizens grew indignant at the action of the council and roundly scored the members for allowing a suspension of traffic in the middle of the day. Mayor Teague and Chief of Police Taylor personally saw to the arrest of the officers of Traction Company and 20 of motormen and conductors. Mayor Teague was opposed to the ordinance and vetoed it, but was passed over his disapproval. The law did not contemplate that partitions could be used to separate the races, but provided for separate cars for each race.
And I think that this is a key point to make. Jim Crow segregation, particularly in transit, doesn't make money. And 50 years from now, this would be the main weakness that residents chose to exploit in order to bring it down. Viola White was an African-American woman who lived in Montgomery, Alabama. At 35 years old, in 1944, she was arrested for refusing to give up her seat. The story goes like this. While riding the bus, she was ordered by the bus driver to give up her seat. When she refused, the bus driver threatened to throw her off the bus. However, she continued to refuse. The bus driver ended up calling the police, and once the police arrived, they removed her off the bus, beat her, and arrested her. In court, she was found guilty and was charged a $10 fine. With help from civil rights leader E.D. Nixon, White submitted several appeals for her charges. However, the city of Montgomery refused to even put the appeals on the court calendar because they knew they couldn't win. In retaliation to White's attempts to appeal her charges, Inger, a local police officer, kidnapped White's 16-year-old daughter, drove her to a cemetery, and arrested her. Fortunately, White's daughter was able to memorize Inger's license plate. E.D. Nixon attempted several times to get the judge to sign a warrant for policeman Inger's arrest. Did I say Ingers or Ingers? Damn, probably butchered that name. I'm sorry. Anyways, once the warrant was signed, the police chief... Wait a minute. I'm not sorry. He was a... What am I apologizing for? The police chief tipped off Inger that he had a warrant for him and was about to be arrested. Inger ended up leaving town and escaping from being detained. Shortly after, Viola White passed away, derailing any further legal action. Between 1944 and 1955, there were many other occasions where women refused to give up their seats across the U.S. On March 2nd, 1955, 9 months before Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white man, 15-year-old Claudette Colvin, a student at the segregated Booker T. Washington High School, was riding a crowded Montgomery bus home when a white woman boarded the bus, and Robert W. Clear, the bus driver, commanded Colvin and 4 other black women to give up their seats so that white riders had more room to sit. 3 of the black women moved, which left 15-year-old Colvin and a pregnant woman named Ruth Hamilton the only ones sitting. The bus driver commanded a second time for them to stand up. They refused. This led bus driver Clear to call the police. When the police arrived, they convinced the black man to give up his seat so that Miss Hamilton could sit. Thomas J. Ward and Paul Headley, the policemen, commanded Colvin to stand up one last time. She refused. Colvin was then forcefully taken off the bus and arrested. Colvin would be initially charged with disturbing the peace, violating the segregation laws, and battering and assaulting a police officer, the latter of which witnesses testified against. Colvin was later bailed out by her minister, and through the trial was represented by Fred Gray, a civil rights attorney that worked for the Montgomery Improvement Association. 4 days after Colvin refused to give up her seat, on May 6, 1955, the charges for disturbing the peace and violating the segregation laws were dropped. Unfortunately, her conviction for assaulting a police officer was upheld. After Claudette Colvin's case, the Women's Political Council began formulating plans to boycott the Montgomery bus lines. These plans would quickly be dropped. The reason why? She was pregnant and not married. This was deemed a huge problem for the movement, as intercourse outside of wedlock, especially in the 1950s, was greatly shunned upon. Miss Colvin's reputation would have and was destroyed, and civil rights leaders argued that had Miss Colvin been attached to the movement's reputation would have been destroyed with her. Claudette Colvin's impact was essentially scrubbed from the record. It would be decades before Miss Colvin was accurately recognized. Let's talk about another woman who refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus. Another woman that's not Rosa Parks. 40 days before Rosa Parks, a woman named Mary Louise Smith refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus. A week before, a white woman refused to pay her for cleaning her house for the week, and her pay was only $2 a day. This meant that Smith had to go home without her $11. The following week, Smith returned to get her pay, but after knocking on the door for a while, nobody answered. Even more frustrated, Smith got back on the bus to go back home. While on the bus, a white lady asked the bus driver to tell her to move. The bus driver asked her 3 times to give up her seat, and all 3 times, she refused. The thing is, Smith believed that she was sitting in the colored section, so she told him that she wasn't going to move from her seat and that she had the privilege to sit here like anybody else. The bus driver called the cops and she was arrested. But why didn't this spearhead the movement? Why did it take a whole month and a half until Rosa Parks? Well, the truth of the matter is, popular black activist and leader E.D. Nixon, again, made plans to make this case one that they could use so that they could publicly fight against Jim Crow segregation in buses. However, after showing up to the Smith residence and seeing Frank Smith, Mary Louise Smith's father, sitting in a drunken stupor on the front porch, he convinced the other activist leaders that the Mary Louise Smith case couldn't be the symbol for the movement because her father was a drunkard. This would give the movement much unneeded negative publicity. The thing is, historians are not sure whether or not E.D. Nixon was actually telling the truth, as residents who knew the Smith family continued to back up the fact that Frank Smith was not a drunkard. Before we get to Rosa Parks, it is important to mention that a month after Mary Louise Smith refused to give up her seat, on November 25th, 1955, the Interstate Commerce Commission ruled that racial segregation on interstate trains and buses had to end by January 10th, 1956. An excerpt from The Guardian at the time read,
"It should be understood that today's rulings apply only to travel between states. The rulings have no effect on travel within a southern state." Mr. Eugene Cook, Attorney General for Georgia, said he would try to use all legal procedures to maintain racial segregation
on travel within Georgia itself.
He conceded the difficulties because it is often hard to separate interstate travelers from those traveling within the state alone. However, he had asked his legal staff to study this problem while giving first priority to Georgia's continued resistance to a unified public school system in the state.
Even though buses within southern states were still segregated, this ruling definitely gave the future movement momentum. Less than a week later, on December 1st, 1955, the famous Rosa Parks incident happened. At this point in time, I would tell the story about Rosa Parks, but we're running out of time in this video, and I partially set it up that way because most of us already know her story, or the one they teach us at least in textbooks. The point of this video is to understand that the history we learned about the Montgomery boycott and desegregation on transit in general was completely manufactured. The Montgomery bus boycott didn't start with Rosa Parks. It started from a slow buildup of mostly women who sat down and refused to give up their seats on buses in the name of desegregation. These 3 Montgomery women were almost chosen to become the next Rosa Parks. But unfortunately, due to death or their personal lives not being seen as fit for the movement, they weren't chosen. But that's the thing, Rosa Parks was chosen. Rosa Parks herself, her personality, and her history was nearly perfect for the movement. And I say nearly perfect because they had to tweak a few things, like the fact that she wasn't super old and frail and tired when she didn't give up her seat. Rosa Parks was an activist, and always had been an activist. Her husband was a member of the NAACP, and she worked for E.D. Nixon throughout all of his cases. I say all that to say this: when she sat down on that bus and refused to give up her seat to that white man, she already knew about the women before her. She knew that she was going to start a revolution.
In the rain and the sun and the dark of night, they walked with God and shunned the buses. They walked with God and they rode with God too, for they formed a carpool that was a marvel of quick organization. A network of cars, old and new, of trucks and taxis, reached out across the city and carried people where they wanted to go. It started as a one-day protest, nothing more. But it grew until it rocked the cradle of the Confederacy and told the world a story of Negro people united for action without bitterness, without malice, without fear. It began with the buses in Montgomery, but so much more is at stake now, for this is a part of a struggle going on around the world, for the right to enjoy decent homes like anyone else, to work at better jobs for higher pay, the right to an equal place in the family of man.